Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Kinane. Coming up, WikiLeaks releases its Guantanamo files, support for a republic hits a 17-year low, and China about to become the world's largest economy. Our panel tonight, Peter Lewis from Essential Media, editor of the Daily Grind website, Joe Stella, and Connor Duffy from ABC's 7:30. First up tonight, another series of secret files has been released by the whistleblower website WikiLeaks. This time, around 700 files containing military assessments of detainees held inside Guantanamo Bay. The documents include files on Australians David Hicks and Mamdouh Habib, and Connor, some really interesting stuff in there too about how many innocent people had been held in Guantanamo Bay, over 150 according to these reports.
That's right, Steve. There's great detail in here about the breakdown of how they rounded up these men and exactly what they've done. At the time, the Bush administration said that these were the worst of the worst, and certainly some of them, were very high-ranking members of Al-Qaeda, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but it seems that many more were innocent. There was 150, as you mentioned, that were brought to Guantanamo, some without any reasons at all for being there. There was great detail about how they rounded them up too. At one point, they went after people that had a certain brand of Casio watch from the 1980s, which is disturbing. First, on a level that they're trying to find people who want to attack the United States, and secondly, in terms of the respect for the rule of law, in that people are effectively kidnapped and brought from one country to an offshore detention centre in the US that we know uses torture. So of the 780 men who went through there, 150 were found to be innocent, another 220 were found to be at low-level risks. Another 380 were low-level foot soldiers, and about 220 were seen as quite dangerous.
And we talked before about those 150 innocent. One of them was a Saudi Arabian man who was running a charity. He was in there for 12 months, detained, interrogated, then released, and he could run his charity again.
That's right. There was an 89-year-old man with dementia as well, a number of juveniles, a 14-year-old even. These were people that we were told were the worst of the worst.
Let's talk about the file that was released today about David Hicks. So there's a five-page file on him that you can look at it on the WikiLeaks website if you want to. And probably the most interesting thing to come out of that document was that they considered him to be a high risk and that it was likely he would become a mercenary if released.
That's right. I spoke to my colleague at 7:30, Lee Sales, who's written a very authoritative book on David Hicks, and she said most of what's in here we've known already, but it is interesting how the whoever wrote this report in the US seemed to regard him as someone who was regarded quite highly by other detainees, who was seen as a leader. He was determined as a high risk in 2004 and then subsequently released with what most people saw as a fairly minor sentence. So there seems a bit of a discrepancy between what they thought in 2004 and what ended up happening to him.
Peter, what are your thoughts on what's been released today?
Look, what I think is interesting is that while there has been a lot of criticism of the whole WikiLeaks project and Julian Assange, this actually appears to me to be the sort of information that it's really useful to have out in the public domain. These are people that were being held without any sort of process of law in a country that was in a compound that had been set up to avoid that, Australian citizens included. And the information that you read today doesn't actually... there's no information there that gets me to be able to form an opinion one way or the other, but the fact that it's out there and should have been put before a court of law in some way, I say this is where WikiLeaks is performing both the public services is consistent with the principles that Assange says is guiding him in this mission.
Joe, is it a good thing that this stuff's come out?
It confirms a lot of what we already know. On the one hand, that a lot of what the American government has done in relation to Guantanamo Bay was mishandled, that a lot of human rights abuses went on in terms of their whole... the way that they dealt with enemy combatants in Afghanistan. But I mean, it also underscores the fact that something like Guantanamo Bay was needed in a conflict where you have these enemy combatants, you have people who aren't necessarily wearing the uniform of the state who you're going to war against. How do you keep these people off the battlefield for the duration of hostilities? Clearly among these people there were people who shouldn't have been sent to Guantanamo Bay, but also a lot of people who should, David Hicks among them.
Joe, sorry, Pete?
Well, surely that's the failure of this project, though. Yes, you've got to get people off the battlefield, but there needs to be a process to filter them out before they've been locked away in a hellhole for 2 or 3 years or more.
Do you filter them out, though, on the battlefield, or do you do it away from the battlefield? I mean, you could leave them to the tender mercies of the Afghan government or the Pakistani government.
Somewhere, government,
yeah, exactly, somewhere in the near area, or you could remove them to US soil, where, although the process wasn't perfect, there was still a process of review going on.
think it's
away
a point
from
that
the
it wasn't
battlefield.
US soil as well. It was somewhere they could be taken where US laws didn't apply. So.
I wouldn't accept that it's a place where the rule of law had completely broken down. Certainly they weren't entitled to the same protections as US citizens, or indeed anybody in the continental US, but it's not the case that anything went at Guantanamo Bay either.
Joe, it's a reminder that President Obama said he'd shut it down and that he hasn't.
He has not, and I think that speaks to the need for this facility.
Do anyone know what attempted murder by an unprivileged belligerent is as well, which was one of the charges recommended against Hicks? It sounds fascinating.
Unprivileged belligerent, I think, means that you're not fighting for the army of a nation state and you're not following orders of a sovereign country, so you therefore lose whatever protection you have under international law as a soldier who's following orders. So you're someone who's
Particularly belligerent.
They are not POWs in the traditional sense.
Con, a very interesting case that came out in this too, which has been talked about before, but the Al Jazeera journalist who was detained for 6 years.
That's right. Allegedly, according to this information, to garner information about the operations of Al Jazeera, a news service which, they have a pretty good record of transparency. I mean, it's not like penetrating Soviet Russia to try and get information on Al Jazeera. And for that cameraman who was detained for 6 years,